She lay in the summer of 1959, beneath the dim light of a New York hospital room, her breath shallow, her body frail. Police officers stood guard at the door, not to protect her but to keep her bound, for even as life slipped away, she remained under arrest. The newspapers wrote of scandal, of narcotics, of the long decline of Billie Holiday. Yet outside the hospital, her voice continued to echo from jukeboxes in darkened bars and from radios that spilled her sorrow into kitchens and living rooms. The world still listened, even as her own voice faltered into silence. Dearest listener, before we step into her story, I invite you to share where you are listening from and at what moment of your day you wander into this circle of memory. Write your thoughts below so that this tale becomes not only mine but ours, stretched across time and distance. And if you wish to help preserve such stories, remember to press the subscribe button so that this gathering of voices may continue. Now let us begin. The year was 1959, and Billie Holiday was only 44 years old when she entered the final chapter of her life. The hospital bed was narrow, its white sheets stiff. To those who came to see her, she seemed both smaller and larger than life, diminished in body yet swollen with the weight of legend. Her liver was failing, her heart weakened, her veins carrying the scars of years of use and abuse. Yet her eyes, when they opened, still carried the same searching light that once gazed across smoky clubs in Harlem, daring audiences to hear not only her song, but her truth. It is strange to think of her ending here, surrounded not by the warmth of family or the comfort of her peers, but by officers enforcing the will of a government that had pursued her for years. Handcuffs had been placed on her wrists, as though the frail woman before them could rise from the bed and escape. Her bank account had been seized, and though she was known across continents, she lay there destitute. It is in this paradox we find the image of Billie Holiday, a woman exalted for her art, yet crushed for her life, a voice raised for freedom, yet silenced by power. How does one arrive at such a place? How does a girl born to a teenage mother in Baltimore, poor and unprotected, grow into the figure who redefined the sound of American song, and then, in her final hour, return to chains? To follow her path is to walk a road paved with contradictions, triumph and despair, love and betrayal, melody and silence. The hospital smells of antiseptic and weary breath. Outside, the city does not pause. Taxis clatter over potholes, children shout in the heat of summer, jazz pours from radios. Yet within the room all is hushed except for the fragile rhythm of her breathing. Visitors come and go. Friends, fellow musicians, reporters seeking one last glimpse of a legend. Some recall her laughter, her sharp wit, her love for small dogs and bright flowers. Others see only the marks of addiction, the legacy of scandal. She had become, in these last days, less a woman than a myth to be dissected. But before myth, there was the girl, the young woman, the rising star who carried with her the story of America's pain and promise. Perhaps in those quiet moments before the morphine took her deeper, she too wandered back in memory. Perhaps she thought of her mother, Sadie, young and struggling, who gave birth to her in 1915 when she herself was scarcely beyond girlhood. Perhaps she remembered the streets of Baltimore, rough and unforgiving, where she learned that survival was a song one had to sing with clenched teeth. Or perhaps she thought of the nights in Harlem when her voice first caught the attention of strangers, when applause swelled around her like a tide, and she knew she had found the one place where she could turn her suffering into beauty. We too shall wander back with her. To understand Billie Holiday, we cannot begin at the end, though the end lingers like smoke. We must walk the crooked path from her first cries in a poor Baltimore house to the moments when she stood before orchestras, transforming silence into a music no one had heard before. For her voice was not born in luxury. It was shaped by hardship, by longing, by the ever-present shadow of exclusion. And yet, is that not the mystery? That beauty so enduring could arise from wounds so deep. Was her suffering the crucible of her art, or was it a chain that threatened always to drag her under? We cannot answer, only listen. The room grows dim as night falls on that summer of 1959. Outside, neon signs hum and the streets glow with the restless lights of the city. Inside, Billie Holiday drifts towards silence while her records spin on turntables across the land, filling rooms with her ghost. That is where we shall leave her for now, not in death, but in the threshold between the present silence and the memories that rise. For when she closes her eyes, we open ours upon another scene, the cracked sidewalks of Baltimore decades earlier, where a small girl wandered with hunger in her belly and songs yet unborn in her chest. She does not yet know the weight of the name she will carry, nor the burdens that await her. She only knows the narrow streets, the laughter of other children who sometimes mocked her, the tired figure of her mother leaving for work, and the absence of a father who was always somewhere else. The story begins here, in hardship, as so many do. The cracked sidewalks of Baltimore in the year 1915 held within their uneven stones the beginnings of a story that would one day echo far beyond those narrow streets. A small girl named Eleanora Fagan was born in a poor neighborhood, the daughter of Sadie Fagan, herself little more than a child at the age of 16, and Clarence Holiday, a restless young musician who would drift in and out of her life like a shadow that could never be caught. In that first cry, no one heard the future voice of Billie Holiday. No one saw the glimmer of an icon. They saw only a baby born into poverty, another fragile life in a city where survival was never promised. The streets around her childhood home were loud and unkind. The sound of streetcars clattering along their rails, the shouts of vendors, the barking of dogs, and the occasional laughter of children formed the backdrop of her earliest memories. There was little warmth within the walls of her home. Sadie worked tirelessly, often gone, leaving the young Billie in the care of relatives or neighbors who might not have been gentle. Clarence, her father, pursued his own dreams of playing the guitar and banjo, and though he carried music within him, he carried little responsibility. He would appear and disappear, his absence more constant than his presence, leaving Billie with a yearning for stability she would never quite find. Poverty wrapped itself around her childhood like a cold blanket. Hunger was familiar, neglect was common, and the streets became both playground and prison. There were whispers, too, of the dangers that lurked in alleyways and behind closed doors. By the age of 10, she had already known abuse, the kind that steals innocence and leaves scars invisible but deep. What chance did such a child have, one might ask, to carve a place in the world? And yet within her, something stirred, something restless and unyielding. Perhaps it was the voice of her mother urging her onward, or perhaps it was the faint echo of her father's strings, or perhaps it was simply the necessity of finding a way to survive when there seemed no way at all. When Billie was scarcely more than an adolescent, her mother left Baltimore to seek work in New York, leaving her daughter behind for stretches of time. For some children, such abandonment would break them. For Billie, it became another lesson in self-reliance. She wandered the streets, worked where she could, cleaned houses, carried buckets, did whatever was asked of her for pennies. The neighborhood was unforgiving, but there was one solace that cut through the noise of hardship: music. She first heard the voices of Louis Armstrong and Bessie Smith, not in concert halls, but in the small, crowded spaces where records spun and radios hummed. Their sound seemed to lift itself above the grime of the city, above the cruelty of daily life, and offered something close to hope. Billie, still just a girl, would close her eyes and listen. Armstrong's trumpet, warm and golden, seemed to speak directly to her. Bessie Smith's voice, powerful and aching, carved out a place in her imagination where she too might one day pour her suffering into song. Did she sense, even then, that her voice would one day join theirs in the pantheon of jazz? Or was it simply the comfort of a dream, fragile and necessary to keep her heart beating against despair? But dreams, however bright, must live alongside the harshness of reality. At the age of 11, Billie was sent to a Catholic reform school, charged with being beyond parental control. The institution was stern, the nuns demanding. Discipline fell upon her as hard as any stone from the street, and she felt the weight of being judged not for what she had done, but for what she represented. A poor, neglected girl without protection. Yet even here, there were hints of resilience. In the quiet hours of the chapel or the stillness of night, Billie found herself humming. Perhaps it was prayer, perhaps defiance, perhaps simply the need to remind herself that she was alive. When she returned to the outside world, Baltimore offered no gentler embrace. By her early teens, she was thrust into the harsh realities of survival. Work was scarce, and often it was the streets themselves that dictated how one might find food or shelter. Some accounts tell of Billie working in houses of ill repute, running errands, cleaning, even at times being drawn into darker corners of that world. These were not years of innocence, they were years of survival. And yet, even as she endured indignities, even as shadows pressed upon her, she carried within her a song that was not yet fully born. It is tempting, when looking back, to ask whether fate was already carving a path for her, whether each hardship was preparing the ground for the voice that would one day haunt audiences. Yet we must tread carefully. To romanticize suffering is to risk dishonoring the child who suffered. Better to say that within Billie, despite all that weighed upon her, there was a spark that refused to go out. Perhaps it was no more than the stubborn will to live. Perhaps that is enough. In time, the pull of New York became irresistible. Her mother, Sadie, had made her way there, carving out a modest existence, and Billie followed. The move was not a flight toward opportunity so much as a step away from the relentless poverty of Baltimore. Yet New York, too, had its hardships. Harlem in the 1920s was alive with music, art, and culture. But for a girl like Billie, it was also alive with dangers. She found herself once more at the margins, cleaning floors, running errands, brushing shoulders with lives more desperate than her own. And yet, within those streets, music lived more vividly than anywhere she had ever known. She would wander past clubs where the sound of horns spilled into the night, where voices rose and fell like waves, where rhythm pulsed through the very walls. She listened, absorbed, and imitated. She would stand before a mirror and sing to herself, shaping phrases not with training or technique, but with instinct and raw emotion. Her phrasing was unlike others. It bent words, stretched them, pulled them into the shape of her own experience. Where others might sing a note straight and pure, Billie let it sag with sorrow or lift with fragile hope. Already, though she could not have known it, she was remaking the language of song. But before the clubs, before the records, there was still hunger, still poverty, still the gnawing uncertainty of each day. In those early years in Harlem, she was simply another girl trying to find her way, another young woman with scars invisible to those who passed her by. Yet perhaps, in the quiet of her rented room, with the distant sound of a trumpet leaking through the night air, she dreamed. Perhaps she imagined herself on a stage, bathed in light, singing not only for herself, but for all those whose voices were never heard. The cracked sidewalks of Baltimore had taught her resilience. The restless streets of Harlem would soon teach her to transform that resilience into song. But in these early years, she was still Eleonora, still a child of hardship, still a young woman searching for a place in the world. The voice that would make her immortal was already forming, though she herself could not yet hear it. And so we leave her here, standing on a Harlem corner, the hum of music spilling into the night, her gaze drawn toward the sound as if it were calling her name. The streetlight flickers above her, casting a halo upon the pavement, and the question lingers, Will this city embrace her or devour her? The answer waits within the next doorway she dares to open. The streetlight flickered above her, and the doorway seemed to beckon. Within the walls of Harlem's small clubs in the early 1930s, music did not merely play. It breathed, it swayed, it filled every corner with life. Eleonora, soon to be known to the world as Billie Holiday, stepped into these places not as a celebrated performer, but as a girl drawn by hunger, curiosity, and the irresistible call of sound. The air inside was thick with smoke and perfume, with the clinking of glasses and the hum of voices that seemed to carry both weariness and joy. The stage was small, sometimes only a corner cleared of tables, but to those who gathered it became a temple. In Harlem, she was no longer wandering the lonely sidewalks of Baltimore. Here, every block pulsed with rhythm, every open window let slip a fragment of song. The Renaissance was not yet fading, and poets, painters, dancers, and singers all carved out space where creativity stood against the weight of daily hardship. For a girl who had spent her life on the margins, this neighborhood offered a strange kind of belonging. Harlem in those years was alive with contradictions: poverty and brilliance, exploitation and freedom, cruelty and beauty. Perhaps Billie sensed at once that it was the only soil where she might grow. She began not with grandeur, but with small steps. A club owner might let her sing a number when another act failed to show. A pianist, weary of filling the silence, might allow the young girl to try her voice. At first she was shy, her body slight, her presence quiet. But when she sang, something shifted. Her voice was not large. It could not soar like an operatic instrument, nor shake walls like Bessie Smith's thunder. Yet what it carried was a truth so naked that it silenced the chatter of glasses and pulled eyes toward her. Listeners heard something they could not name: fragility and defiance woven together, pain bending each phrase, tenderness breaking through even the roughest lyrics. In these dimly lit clubs, Billie began to discover herself. She listened to Louis Armstrong's phrasing, to how he bent a note until it seemed to cry, and she listened to Bessie Smith's authority, the way each word fell like a stone in a still pond. But she did not copy them. She absorbed them into something wholly her own. She lingered on syllables as if unwilling to let them go. She slid into notes as though testing the water before plunging in. To some, it might have sounded uncertain, but to those who listened closely, it was the sound of life itself, uncertain, wounded, yearning, yet unbroken. What did she think in those first nights when applause greeted her? Did she feel the first sparks of destiny, or only relief that the crowd had not laughed her away? She was still just a teenager, still carrying the weight of hunger and the memory of Baltimore's streets. The men who lingered at the back of the room, the women in bright dresses leaning close to hear her better, the musicians who exchanged glances over their instruments, each saw in her something different. Yet perhaps none of them, not even Billie herself, knew what was being born in those moments. Work came irregularly. She was not yet a headliner, not yet the Lady Day who would reshape American song. But word traveled. Musicians spoke of the young woman with the voice unlike any other. A pianist might recommend her to a band leader. A club owner might whisper her name to another. Harlem, though vast in its energy, was small in its circles. Soon she found herself invited to sing more often, and though the money was meager, it was a kind of liberation. No longer only scrubbing floors or running errands, she began to see herself as something more. There were nights when she sang for crowds barely paying attention, their minds on drinks or dice games or whispered arguments in shadowed booths. There were nights when hecklers sneered, dismissing her slight frame, her quiet demeanor. But there were also nights when the room fell utterly still, when her voice carried sorrow like incense through the haze, and the audience leaned forward, caught by something they did not expect. These were the nights that mattered, for they told her that the song within her had power. Life outside the clubs remained difficult. She and her mother often struggled to pay rent, to find steady work. The Harlem of glittering jazz was also a Harlem of cramped apartments and landlords knocking at doors. Billie carried with her the bruises of poverty, and in time she would carry new bruises too, given by the hands of men she trusted. But in these early years, there was still innocence in her hope, still a belief that song could lead her somewhere beyond the struggle. The musicians around her began to notice. She had a way of fitting herself into the spaces of a melody that no one else attempted. Where others might race through a line, Billie slowed, bent, broke it into fragments, reshaped it until it was entirely her own. In time, this would become her hallmark, the art of phrasing, of turning a familiar song into something utterly changed. But in those early Harlem nights, it was simply her instinct, born of hardship and heartache, that made her sing this way. The doorways of Harlem offered her not only stages, but also dangers. The same clubs that gave her voice a place to bloom also exposed her to the darker world of alcohol, drugs, and men who saw her as vulnerable. In later years, she would reflect on these beginnings with a mix of gratitude and sorrow. Harlem had given her a stage, but it had also set the stage for struggles that would never leave her. Yet could it have been otherwise? Could Billie Holiday have become Billie Holiday without first walking through those smoke-filled rooms, without first bending her voice to meet the cries and laughter of Harlem nights? Perhaps, or perhaps not. What is certain is that the girl from Baltimore, with her scars and her hunger, had found a place where her voice mattered. She was no longer only Eleanora Fagan, the child of hardship. She was beginning to shape the figure who would one day be called Lady Day, though she did not yet know it. Each night she sang, she stepped a little further into that identity, into that legacy. And so we leave her here, in a Harlem club, the lights dim, the smoke curling upward, her voice carrying across the small room. Outside, the night is restless, filled with the sounds of the city, but within, there is silence, except for her song. A glass is set down too hard, a chair scrapes across the floor, but still she sings, her eyes half closed, her heart somewhere between Baltimore and the future. The audience listens, some with tears they cannot explain. The last note fades, and in the hush that follows, a door seems to open toward what lies ahead. The larger stages, the recording studios, the moments when the world itself would pause to listen. The hush lingered after her final note, as though the air itself was reluctant to let go of the sound. In that silence lay the seed of something greater, for soon the voice that silenced a Harlem crowd would begin to echo in rooms far beyond those smoky walls. What began as a girl daring to sing when others had left a stage vacant would grow into the birth of an artist whose phrasing, whose very way of bending words, would change the course of American song. Word of her unusual talent began to drift from mouth to mouth, musician to musician, like a secret worth sharing. Piano players who had accompanied her spoke of the way she seemed to wrap herself around a melody, dragging it back into herself before offering it to the world again. Band leaders, always searching for something fresh to draw the crowds, took note. It was not a matter of power. Her voice was never strong in the conventional sense. It was a matter of truth. Each syllable seemed to carry more than just sound. It carried memory, wound, longing. By the early 1930s, she began to attract attention from men who held doors open in the music world. One of the first to recognize her was the producer and critic John Hammond, who had already helped bring forward the genius of Benny Goodman. Hammond heard in her something wholly new. She did not sound like the polished singers of the day who delivered notes with clarity, but little intimacy. She sounded like herself, untrained and unvarnished, yet haunting. To Hammond, it was as though the very soul of jazz had found a voice. He arranged for her to make her first recordings. They were small affairs at first, with studio musicians filling in, but to Billie, it must have seemed like stepping from a shadow into a faint glow of light. The studio smelled of warm metal and cigarette smoke. The floorboards creaked, and the band tuned their instruments with little ceremony. She was nervous, but when the red light flicked on and the band began, instinct overtook her. Into the heavy horn lines and steady beat, she slipped her voice, hesitant at first, then curling into the spaces between notes, weaving her own rhythm where none had been written. The first recordings were not great triumphs in themselves, but they carried whispers of what was to come. Listeners noticed the way she caressed a line, the way she made even a light-hearted tune sound, shaded with depth. Soon she was invited to sing with bigger bands, her name beginning to circulate in places where decisions were made and futures shaped. She sang with Benny Goodman, and later with Count Basie, each collaboration bringing her into the orbit of wider audiences. Yet even as she stepped onto larger stages, she remained very much herself. She did not change to fit the orchestras. Rather, the orchestras bent subtly to fit her. To hear her in those early days was to be startled by the contrast. The bands blared bright, polished, and brassy, but then her voice would enter. Soft, vulnerable, almost conversational. She seemed to take her time with each line, daring the listener to lean in. Where another singer might push against the volume of trumpets and drums, Billie floated above them or nestled quietly within their frame. The effect was startling and soon irresistible. Musicians marveled at her sense of timing. She did not simply keep rhythm, she played with it. A line that should have landed squarely on the beat might fall behind it, dragging its heels like a weary traveler, or she might dart ahead, pressing forward as though impatient to reveal the truth of the lyric. This freedom made her sound unlike anyone else, and though at first it puzzled some, it became the very hallmark of her style. In the clubs where she continued to perform, audiences began to notice too. They came not only to drink or to dance, but to hear that strange, compelling voice that seemed to speak directly to them. For a young woman who had known so little care in her early life, the attention must have felt both wondrous and unsettling. Applause can be as intoxicating as any substance, but it can also place a burden heavy to bear. Already, Billie's life was becoming a balance between the glow of admiration and the shadows of her private struggles. She was still very young, barely in her 20s, when she found herself in demand across Harlem and beyond. The bright lights of the Cotton Club, the smoky warmth of cafe society, the crowded dance halls all open to her. She was no longer simply a girl with a voice. She was becoming an artist with a reputation. Yet for all the stages and recording booths, she remained grounded in her own truth. She did not dress her voice in glitter or polish it for the masses. She sang as she felt, and what she felt was often sorrow, longing, or the memory of survival. One can imagine her standing backstage, the hum of the crowd filtering through the curtains, the horns of the band tuning in the distance. She might take a drag from a cigarette, glance into the mirror, and see not a star, but the same girl who had once walked the cracked sidewalks of Baltimore. Yet when she stepped into the light, when she closed her eyes and let the first note fall, she became something else, something timeless. Was it destiny, or was it the simple fact that the world had never heard such a voice before? We cannot know. What is certain is that these first recordings, these first appearances with great orchestras, marked the transition from Billie the girl to Billie Holiday, the singer. The city that had once seemed so harsh now began to embrace her, even as it still demanded more than it gave. Yet every triumph carried its shadow. Success drew not only admirers, but also temptations, dangers, and those who would exploit her. The same clubs that paid her to sing also paid in alcohol and camaraderie that could slip into dependency. The men who praised her voice often saw her as fragile and sought to control her. And within Billie herself, there remained the restlessness of a soul that had never known safety. Music was her salvation, but it could not shield her from all else. For now, however, she was on the rise. The applause grew louder, the names in the audience more powerful, the reviews more glowing, and at the heart of it all was her voice, untrained yet unforgettable, a thread of raw silk winding its way through the fabric of jazz. She had found not only a stage, but a place in the story of American music, though she could not yet know how high or how low that place would carry her. As another performance drew to its close, the crowd's applause thundered, yet Billie's eyes remained distant. The lights blinded her, the smoke curled, the band played on. But within her there was always that tension, that tug between the brightness of acclaim and the shadows of her own life. The final note drifted upward and dissolved into silence, leaving both her and her listeners suspended between awe and uncertainty. And in that silence lay the next doorway, leading not to another club, but to something darker, more daring and more dangerous, a song that would shake the conscience of a nation. The silence that followed her final note lingered, as if the audience hesitated to breathe, afraid that sound itself might shatter the fragile spell she had cast. Out of that silence, opportunities began to rise. It was no longer only small Harlem clubs that called her name, but great orchestras, traveling bands, and men of music who saw in her voice something that could not be contained by dim lights and crowded tables. Soon the path before Billie Holiday stretched wider than she could ever have imagined in those first tentative nights of singing. Count Basie was among the first to invite her into his orbit. His orchestra, already a force in the swing era, carried the weight of rhythm and brilliance, each musician a master of his craft. To join such a group was no small honor for a young singer whose career was just beginning to climb. Standing among the brass, the reeds, the drums, and the pulsing bass, Billie found herself both dwarfed and elevated. The band thundered and soared, yet when her voice entered, it was as though time itself slowed to let her be heard. She did not try to outmatch the force of the orchestra. Instead, she curved her phrasing into the spaces between the notes, weaving intimacy into grandeur, stitching sorrow into swing. Her time with Basie's orchestra was brief, but it revealed the strange alchemy of her gift. She had a way of making even the most jubilant arrangement sound, tinged with melancholy, as though joy itself bore the memory of loss. Audiences who came expecting only dance and delight found themselves caught by something deeper, and though some resisted, many returned again and again, unable to escape the pull of her voice. It was not only Basie who saw her power. Artie Shaw, a clarinetist whose band had begun to make waves, also drew her into his ensemble. This collaboration was remarkable not only for its music, but for its defiance of social boundaries. Shaw was white, his band largely white, and in an America still bound by segregation, bringing Billie into such a group was a bold act. Together they toured, Billie singing while Shaw's clarinet danced around her, the band swinging behind. The music they made was electrifying, but the world around them was less welcoming. Audiences in certain cities bristled at the sight of a black woman sharing the stage with white musicians. Hotels and venues refused her entry, demanding she eat and sleep apart, no matter how brightly she had shone under the lights. For Billie, these moments cut deep. The applause of one night could dissolve into humiliation the next, as she was forced to use the back door, to stay in inferior lodgings, to endure the sting of insults flung casually by those who had just listened to her sing. Was the music enough to balance the indignities? Did she wonder, even then, if the world would ever hear her without prejudice? Yet she continued, her voice carrying not only notes, but defiance, each phrase a quiet refusal to be silenced by injustice. In the recording studios of these years, she began to carve her place more firmly. Songs like What a Little Moonlight Can Do and Miss Brown to You captured her playful side, her ability to rap light lyrics in charm and rhythm. Critics noted her freshness, her originality, the way she transformed simple melodies into something unforgettable. She was young, radiant in her own unpolished way, and audiences found themselves enchanted. Behind the charm, however, lay shadows, struggles with money, with relationships, with the haunting memories of her past. The public saw only the star beginning to rise. Billie felt the turbulence beneath her feet. It was during this time that she met Lester Young, the tenor saxophonist whose playing was as lyrical and tender as her singing. The bond between them was immediate, a kinship of souls who understood one another without words. He called her Lady Day, and she called him Prez, short for President of the Tenor Sax. Together, their music achieved a rare unity, his horn answering her voice as if the two were engaged in a private conversation overheard by the world. Their friendship gave her strength, even as other relationships faltered, and the recordings they made together remain among the most cherished in jazz history. The nation was beginning to take notice. Radio carried her songs into living rooms far from Harlem, and records spun on phonographs across the country. For listeners who had never set foot in a nightclub, Billie Holiday's voice arrived like a confidant in the dark, speaking of love, of longing, of sorrow, in a way that seemed personal. Unlike other singers whose perfection created distance, Billie's imperfections drew people close. She cracked, she bent notes, she sang as though speaking directly to each listener, and in that intimacy lay her genius. Yet fame is rarely gentle. The demands of touring wore her down, the scrutiny of audiences and critics pressed upon her, and the realities of segregation tore at her dignity. The men who surrounded her were often quick to exploit, slow to protect. Even in moments of triumph, she was never free from struggle. And still she sang, night after night, each performance a balancing act between the glamour presented to the crowd and the weariness carried in her heart. One can picture her stepping onto the stage in a shimmering gown, the spotlight catching her face as the first notes of the orchestra swell. She takes a breath, the audience waiting, and then her voice falls like a shadow across the bright brass. The crowd listens, some swaying, some staring, each caught in her spell. Yet within Billie herself, perhaps there is another image, the child of Baltimore, still hungry, still yearning, still searching for safety in a world that offered so little. The collaborations with Basie and Shaw expanded her horizons, brought her to larger audiences, and began to cement her reputation. But they also revealed the contradictions of her life, celebrated and scorned, lifted up and pushed down, admired on stage and humiliated off it. These contradictions would follow her always, shaping not only her life but her art. For in her music, one hears not only beauty but also the wound of injustice, the ache of longing, the stubborn persistence of hope amid despair. As the final notes of a performance drifted upward, the applause rising, Billie would often lower her gaze, as though retreating inward. The audience cheered, the band smiled, the lights gleamed, but she seemed already somewhere else, already preparing for the next battle, the next song, the next day. And out of that applause, out of that restless silence, a new chapter began. One in which her voice would no longer sing only of romance or moonlight, but would confront the darker truths of her world with a courage that few had dared before. The applause swelled, warm and thunderous, but when it faded, Billie often seemed already gone. Her gaze turned inward, her shoulders drawn, as though she were carrying something heavier than the adoration of strangers. Out of that applause would come, in time, a silence unlike any other, a silence born not of awe alone but of shock, of recognition, of grief too deep for words. For it was in the year 1939, in a Greenwich Village club called Café Society, that Billie Holiday lifted her voice to sing a song unlike any she had sung before, a song that would carve itself into the conscience of a nation. Café Society was itself unusual. It welcomed audiences of every race in an era when segregation still ruled much of America's public life. Intellectuals, radicals, artists, and dreamers crowded into its rooms, where the clink of glasses mingled with the smoke of cigarettes and the murmur of conversation. On its small stage, Billie prepared to sing a piece introduced to her by Abel Mirapol, a teacher and activist who had written a poem set to music. The song was called Strange Fruit. Its subject was lynching, that most brutal and haunting act of racial terror, still prevalent in the South and seldom acknowledged openly in polite society. Billie understood at once the gravity of the song. This was not a tune about love or laughter, not a playful rhythm to make dancers sway. This was testimony, stark and painful. Some friends warned her not to sing it, that it was too dangerous, too political, too likely to provoke wrath. But Billie knew the truth of its words, for she had lived within the shadows of racism her whole life. To stand before an audience and give voice to what others tried to hide was not only bold, it was necessary. The setting for her performance was deliberate. At Café Society, the waiters stopped serving drinks when she sang it. The room was plunged into darkness except for a single spotlight on her face. There would be no distractions, no clinking of glasses, no whispers of conversation. The song demanded full attention. And so she began. Her voice entered quietly, almost conversational, but with each line the weight deepened. Southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. The imagery was stark, the melody simple, yet in Billie's phrasing it became unbearable in its intimacy. She did not shout or wail. She let the words fall like stones into a still pond, each ripple spreading through the silence. By the time she reached the final lines, the room was hushed, and when the last note dissolved, there was no applause at first, only silence heavy and unbroken, as though the audience could not bring themselves to move. That silence was itself the measure of the song's power. Eventually, applause would come, but always after that stunned pause. Listeners left the club shaken, carrying with them images that no melody could soften. In singing Strange Fruit, Billie had done more than perform. She had forced her audience to see, to feel, to confront a reality many wish to ignore. It is said that art reveals truth in ways argument cannot, and in Billie's voice, the truth of racial terror was laid bare. The song became her signature, yet it was also her burden. Each time she sang it, she relived the pain, the horror, the injustice. Each time she sang it, she risked the anger of those who resented its exposure. And each time she bore the silence that followed, a silence that was both recognition and reproach. What must she have felt stepping off the stage after that first performance, the spotlight fading, the room still hushed? Was she proud or was she weary? Did she feel triumph or dread? Perhaps she felt all of these at once, for Billie Holiday was never one to separate her art from her life. The wounds of her world were the wounds of her own body, and she carried them into her music. The song drew attention from beyond the club. Newspapers wrote of it. Audiences sought it out, but so too did authorities. For men like Harry Anslinger, the powerful head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Billie Holiday's voice became more than a threat to musical convention. It became a threat to social order. A black woman standing before mixed audiences, daring to sing of lynching, daring to confront America with its own violence. Such defiance could not go unanswered. And so the watch upon her grew sharper. Yet for a time, in that year of 1939, the song was hers and hers alone, and the impact was undeniable. She recorded it, though many record companies refused to touch it. When the recording was finally made, its power traveled far beyond the walls of Café Society. Radios carried it, records spun it, and in living rooms and dormitories, people sat stunned as Billie Holiday sang of strange fruit hanging from southern trees. It was, some would later say, the beginning of protest music, the first great anthem of the civil rights struggle. But to Billie, it was simply truth, carried in her voice because she could not remain silent. Night after night, she returned to the song. Sometimes the audience would hold their breath. Sometimes they would weep. Sometimes they would leave. She sang it not to please, but to bear witness. And though the song brought her acclaim, it also brought her enemies. There were those who vowed she would pay for such audacity, and in time she would. But for now, she stood in the spotlight, her face lit, her voice trembling yet unwavering, and she told the truth that few dared to hear. The silence that followed each performance of Strange Fruit was not the same as the silence after her earlier songs. This silence was heavier, more haunted, as though the ghosts of the song lingered in the room. And it was from this silence that Billie would step back into the shadows of her own life, into the dangers and persecutions that awaited her. For when an artist dares to tell the truth, the world does not always reward them. More often, it sharpens its knives. The final note of the song hung in the air, then dissolved into darkness. The audience sat still, some trembling, some averting their gaze, some unable to move, and from that silence arose the sound of footsteps, her own leaving the stage, returning to the dim corridors of the club, where smoke hung heavy and whispers grew. Out there, beyond the doors of Café Society, the watchful eye of the authorities waited. Out there, beyond the doors of Café Society, the watchful eye of authority grew sharper, as if the silence that followed Strange Fruit had unsettled not only the audience, but the powers who preferred silence of another kind. Billie stepped from the spotlight into shadows, but the shadows were not empty. They were filled with eyes that followed her, ears that listened for her missteps, hands ready to pull her down. At the center of this watch was Harry Anslinger, the stern and relentless head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. To him, Billie Holiday was more than a singer. She was a challenge, a black woman who refused to bow her head, who carried her defiance not in speeches, but in the raw ache of her music. She had chosen to sing Strange Fruit, and by doing so she had crossed an invisible line. For a system built on silence and denial, her voice was intolerable. Anslinger had made it his mission to root out narcotics, but his war was never waged equally. Musicians, particularly black musicians, became easy targets, symbols of a vice-ridden world he sought to control. Billie, with her fame, her vulnerability, and her refusal to be subdued, became his perfect quarry. He sent agents to watch her, to hound her, to catch her in moments of weakness. And in Billie's life, weakness was never far away. She had already begun to rely on drugs and alcohol, not only as companions, but as shields against the weight of her memories and the burdens of her fame. The heroin soothed her wounds, dulled the sharpness of loss, and for a time gave her the illusion of peace. Yet each time she reached for it, the chains grew tighter. It was into this trap that the authorities pressed harder, waiting not to help but to punish. There is a cruel symmetry in her story. The very government that ignored the lynchings of the South poured its energy into destroying a singer who dared to give those lynchings a voice. Was it truly the heroine they sought to eradicate, or was it the voice that would not remain silent? This question lingers still, unanswered, but the facts are plain. Billie Holiday was hounded more ruthlessly than most, her every move shadowed, her every falter seized upon. Friends noticed the pressure. Musicians whispered of agents in the crowd, of informants close by. Some begged Billie to be cautious, to leave Strange Fruit aside, to temper her fire. But Billie was never one to retreat from the truth, and her stubbornness, her pride, would not allow her to sing only the comfortable songs. She knew the risk, and still she sang. Perhaps she believed that her art was worth any cost, or perhaps she simply could not do otherwise. For Billie Holiday, silence was the true prison. The arrests began to mount. One night, agents stormed into her room, finding what they needed, parading her as a criminal. She faced trial, conviction, and prison, not for violence, not for theft, but for the desperate refuge of a woman who had lived too long with sorrow. The courtroom was cold, the judgment harsher still. She was sentenced, and for a time her voice was silenced behind bars. Yet even in prison, the legend of Billie Holiday did not fade. Fans waited, musicians remembered, and when she emerged, it was with both scars and a strange kind of radiance. At Carnegie Hall, after her release, she sang again, her voice tinged with weariness but filled with defiance. The audience welcomed her, applauded her, celebrated her. And yet she knew the eyes of the Bureau still followed, waiting for her to stumble once more. The persecution was relentless. She was stripped of her cabaret card, the license required to perform in nightclubs that served alcohol. In New York, this meant she could no longer sing in the very places that had nurtured her. To silence Billie Holiday by law was perhaps Anslinger's greatest victory, for it denied her not only livelihood but identity. She could sing in concert halls, but the intimacy of the club, the heart of her art, was closed to her. Imagine her walking past the doors of those nightclubs, hearing the muffled thrum of music within, knowing that by decree she was forbidden to enter, forbidden to sing. For an artist whose life was woven into those spaces, it must have felt like exile. Yet even in exile, she found ways to endure. She performed where she could, recorded when possible, each note a quiet act of resistance. The struggle with addiction deepened. Each attempt to find solace became another opportunity for the authorities to strike. Friends came and went, some loyal, some betraying. Lovers promised comfort, but often delivered only bruises and fresh grief. Billie's life was a battlefield, fought not only on the stage but in the privacy of her own body. And always, hovering above it all, was the shadow of the Bureau, waiting. What did she think in the quiet hours when the audience was gone and only silence remained? Did she rage against the injustice? Did she blame herself for weakness? Or did she simply retreat into the numbness of narcotics, unable to bear the weight of questions with no answers? We cannot know, but we can hear it in her voice. Each recording of those years carries with it not only melody, but struggle, not only beauty, but pain. The listener cannot escape it. The silence after Strange Fruit had once been filled with awe. Now the silence after her performances carried a different weight. The knowledge that this woman was being hunted, that the system arrayed against her sought not her redemption but her destruction. And yet, she sang on, each note a fragile rebellion. As the applause faded one night, she stepped into the wings, her body weary, her eyes shadowed. Outside the stage door, the night was waiting. In the distance, a figure leaned against a wall, watching, as others had watched before. The air was heavy with suspicion, and Billie pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. She walked into the night, carrying both her music and her chains. Ahead lay the deepening struggle with addiction, a struggle that would blur the lines between survival and surrender, between solace and enslavement. She walked into the night with her coat pulled close, her music pressed like an ember within her chest, her chains dragging quietly at her heels. The streets held their usual chorus, the distant hum of traffic, the laughter spilling from taverns, the clatter of footsteps on wet pavement. But to Billie, all of it blended into a single restless noise that offered no comfort. In those shadows, the companions she turned to were not friends or lovers, but the numbing embrace of heroin and alcohol, substances that dulled the bite of memory and softened the sharp edge of persecution. Addiction crept upon her not with sudden force, but with slow, tightening fingers. At first it was an escape, a way to push back the grief of childhood, the loneliness of hotel rooms, the bruises left by men, the sting of humiliation when doors were closed to her because of the color of her skin. A needle could silence these voices for a time. A drink could blur their outlines. But soon the relief itself became a cage, its bars invisible, yet unyielding. She needed more to feel less, and each act of seeking relief became another step deeper into entrapment. The audiences who adored her often did not see this struggle. They saw the gowns, the flowers in her hair, the spotlight catching her profile as she bent into the microphone. They heard the aching beauty of her voice, each song wrapped in intimacy. To them, she was not a woman unraveling, but an artist, refining sorrow into art. Yet those who stood closer, the musicians beside her, the friends who lingered backstage, knew the truth. They saw the trembling hands, the weariness in her eyes, the way she swayed when no music was playing. And yet, even in the grip of addiction, she gave performances that seared themselves into memory. The very fragility of her body seemed to deepen the strength of her voice. She sang not as one untouched by pain, but as one who had lived inside it, and audiences felt it. Her phrasing became slower, more drawn out, her notes carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much. Each song was no longer merely performance. It was confession. There is a paradox here, one that both fascinates and unsettles. Did her suffering make her art greater, or did it only strip her life of peace? Was the beauty of her voice the child of her pain, or was it beauty despite her pain? We cannot say, and perhaps Billie herself never knew. What is certain is that her addiction entwined with her art so tightly that they could not be separated. Each night she sang, the world heard not only the melody but the struggle beneath it. The authorities exploited this weakness mercilessly. Agents who pursued her knew where to strike, when to find her most vulnerable. Arrests followed, trials humiliated her, and prison loomed again and again. Each time she fell, the world seemed eager to watch, the newspapers quick to report scandal. Yet behind the headlines was a woman searching for relief in a world that offered her little. Her relationships during these years often mirrored her addiction, intense, consuming, and destructive. Men promised her care, but delivered betrayal, offered companionship, but left her bruised. Some introduced her to deeper entanglements with drugs, binding her more tightly to the cycle of dependence. She sought love, or at least shelter, but too often found only chains. And still she sang. Picture her late at night, in a small hotel room, the curtains drawn against the neon glow of the city. The air is heavy with smoke, a bottle stands half empty on the table, and her body is slumped against the bed. In her hand, perhaps, the remnants of the night's attempt to forget. The world would see her on stage, radiant in satin, but here she was alone, weary, and bound. Yet even in this solitude, music stirred within her. She might hum a fragment, recall a melody, whisper a line that would find its way into a performance the next evening. For music, even in her darkest moments, did not abandon her. Audiences began to notice the changes. Her voice, once supple and light, grew huskier, roughened by years of strain and smoke. Some critics whispered that she was in decline, that the brilliance of her youth was fading. But others found in this altered voice a deeper truth. The cracks, the rasp, the tremble, all seemed to make the songs more human, more immediate. When she sang of heartache, no one doubted she had lived it. When she sang of despair, no one questioned its authenticity. It is here that Billie Holiday's legacy grew more complex. She was both celebrated and pitied, adored for the very qualities that were slowly destroying her. Listeners leaned closer, as though to catch the fragile thread of a voice that might break at any moment. And in that closeness, they felt her humanity. They applauded her even as they watched her unravel, and perhaps some wondered if they too bore responsibility, if their hunger for her sorrow had driven her deeper into it. The silences after her performances changed in character once more. No longer were they only filled with awe or grief. Sometimes they were filled with unease, as audiences sensed the cost of what they had heard. They clapped, they called for encores, but beneath their admiration lay a question unspoken. How long can she continue? Billie herself must have felt it. Each tour drained her. Each night on stage pulled from her reserves. Each day off stage threatened to swallow her whole. Yet she carried on, not because she was unbroken, but because singing was the only thing that tethered her to life. Without music, there would be only the silence of addiction, and that silence was unbearable. So she sang, and the world listened, even as the authorities tightened their grip, even as her body faltered, even as her lovers betrayed her. The applause still came, though sometimes tinged with sorrow, sometimes with unease. She bowed, she smiled faintly, she left the stage. And once more she stepped into the night, the city's hum surrounding her, her music like a fragile flame against the encroaching dark. Ahead lay new trials, courtrooms and cells, betrayals and losses, moments when even her right to sing would be denied. The applause would not be enough to protect her, and the needle would not be enough to save her. Yet for now, in the hush after her final note, she still carried that ember, the stubborn flame of song that refused to go out, even in the wind of her suffering. She stepped once more into the night, her fragile flame of song flickering against the wind of suffering, and with her walked the shadows of men who promised warmth, yet left bruises. For Billie Holiday, love was never simple, never tender for long. It arrived as fleeting comfort, as a brief reprieve from loneliness, but it so often departed as cruelty, betrayal, or violence. The same hunger that drew her to narcotics, the yearning for release for relief, drew her also toward men who offered shelter and instead built cages. In her early years of success, Billie sought affection as any young woman might, hoping to find safety where the world had offered her none. Yet the men who entered her life seemed to sense her vulnerabilities, and rather than guarding them, they exploited them. Musicians, hustlers, gamblers, men who lingered at the margins of the very clubs where she shone. They circled around her like moths to flame. For a woman so unprotected, so accustomed to surviving alone, their presence at first seemed like salvation. And Billie, ever generous in heart, gave herself fully. She trusted, she hoped, she clung to love as though it might steady her against the storm. But what she found, again and again, was betrayal. Lovers drained her earnings, promising devotion but gambling away her money. Others introduced her more deeply to the very habits that chained her, sharing with her the needle, offering her both closeness and destruction in the same breath. Some beat her, leaving bruises that could be hidden only by the dim glow of stage lights. And still she stayed, believing perhaps that to be loved in pain was better than to be alone. Her most notorious relationships became part of her story. Men like Jimmy Monroe, Joe Guy, and later Louis McKay. Monroe, her first husband, was a hustler, quick with charm and quicker with schemes. Joe Guy, a trumpeter, offered music and companionship, but also deeper entanglement with heroin. Louis McKay, whom she later married, promised protection but too often delivered blows. Each man left his mark, and together they wove a pattern of bruises and betrayals. Yet to dismiss these loves as mere mistakes would be to miss their complexity. Billie herself spoke of them with both bitterness and longing. She wanted what anyone might want, to be cherished, to be safe, to rest her weary body against another's. And at times, in fleeting hours, perhaps she found it. In the warmth of a lover's arm, in whispered promises made after a performance, she may have believed for a moment that the world could be kind. But morning came, and with it the harshness of reality, money gone, tempers flaring, fists raised. Her songs began to carry these bruises within them. When she sang of betrayal, audiences believed her. When she sang of love that soured, they heard not mere interpretation, but lived truth. Don't Explain, a song she would later make her own, captured the weary resignation of a woman who knows her lover has strayed, but chooses to remain. The lyric's surrender was not weakness, but recognition. That love, however flawed, was still love, and she could not bear its absence. It is unsettling to think that her greatest art may have been fed by her deepest wounds. Yet perhaps it was not the suffering itself, but her ability to transform it that gave her music such power. She did not hide her pain. She wove it into melody, offering it to the world as testimony. Audiences may not have known the full details of her life, but they heard in her voice the truth of a woman who had endured and still endured. Picture her after a performance, returning to a hotel room where a lover waited. The applause still echoed faintly in her ears. The scent of flowers still clung to her gown. Yet behind the door, there might be anger, suspicion, or demands. Perhaps a hand raised, perhaps harsh words, perhaps the silent withdrawal that cuts as deep as any blow. In that room, Billie was not the Lady Day the world adored. She was a woman aching for tenderness and too often met with cruelty. And in the morning, she would rise, dress, and step again into the spotlight, carrying the bruises with her unseen. Her friends saw it. Some tried to intervene, others turned away. The cycle was familiar. Quarrels, reconciliations, promises broken and renewed. To outsiders, it may have seemed madness to remain. But for Billie, whose childhood had taught her that abandonment was a constant shadow, leaving might have felt more terrifying than staying. The hunger for love, even in distorted form, was greater than the fear of pain. And yet, within this darkness, her voice shone brighter. Each heartbreak deepened her phrasing. Each betrayal added weight to her notes. She sang not as a detached performer, but as a woman offering pieces of her own heart. The world could not look away, even as it failed to protect her. The contradiction was cruel. Audiences paid to hear the beauty born of her wounds, while those wounds continued to deepen in her private life. Perhaps in quiet moments, she asked herself why love hurt so much. Perhaps she wondered if she was cursed to repeat the same pattern, to seek safety in arms that would only wound her. Or perhaps she did not ask at all, accepting the cycle as part of the life she had been given. For Billie Holiday, questions of fate and choice blurred together, as inseparable as the music and the pain from which it rose. The silences after her performances grew heavier in these years. Listeners heard in her voice not only artistry but confession, not only beauty but bruises. They applauded, sometimes with tears in their eyes, sensing that the woman before them was giving more than song. She was offering her very life. And when the applause faded and she stepped into the wings, the cycle of love and pain awaited once more. And so she walked forward carrying both her music and her bruises, bound by loves that wounded yet refusing to abandon love altogether. The final note of one night dissolved into silence, and from that silence arose another sound, the scratching of a pen, the turning of pages, as Billie began to shape her own story in words, not only in song, for even amid the bruises she longed to speak for herself, to tell the world who she truly was. The scratching of a pen, the turning of pages, these sounds were different from the swell of trumpets or the hush of an audience, yet for Billie they became another form of music. Words set down in ink could carry what her voice could not always hold. In the mid-1950s, battered by years of scandal and persecution, she turned to the act of telling her life story. The result was her autobiography, Lady Sings the Blues, a book at once revealing and elusive, raw yet veiled like a song sung through smoke. She did not write alone. The words were shaped with the help of a journalist, William Dufty, who listened as Billie poured out fragments of memory, half-formed recollections, bitter confessions, and defiant assertions. Together they stitched these fragments into a narrative. Yet even as the pages formed, truth and myth mingled. Some details blurred, others contradicted, still others shone with stark clarity. To read the book is to hear her voice again, not polished, not consistent, but undeniably hers, filled with the same mixture of tenderness, anger, and humor that colored her songs. In those pages, Billie recounted her childhood in Baltimore, her struggles in Harlem, the early days of her career, the betrayals of lovers, the relentless pursuit of the law. She told of hunger, of abuse, of laughter amid despair. She told of nights in jail and nights on stage, of fleeting joys and enduring sorrows. Yet always there was the sense that she was both revealing herself and protecting herself. Memory, like melody, could be bent, stretched, shaded to fit the truth of emotion, even if the facts shifted. Some critics dismiss the book as unreliable, pointing out its inconsistencies, its omissions, its exaggerations. But perhaps reliability was never its purpose. Just as Billie never sang a song the same way twice, so too she told her life as it felt in the telling, not as it might appear in a ledger. What mattered was not precision but expression, not chronology but feeling. Her autobiography was less a history than a performance, another way of shaping her pain into art. Reading the book is like listening to one of her recordings. There are cracks, pauses, sudden turns of phrase that catch the reader off guard. At times, the narrative drifts, then returns with startling force. It is intimate, confessional, yet also guarded, as if Billie were whispering secrets while keeping others locked behind her gaze. And perhaps that is fitting, for no artist gives away everything. Some truths must remain unspoken, lest the self be entirely consumed. The act of telling her story was itself an act of defiance. For years, others had written about her, painted her as scandalous, tragic, broken. By placing her name on the cover of a book, Billie claimed the right to speak in her own voice. Even if the details were blurred, the act declared, "I am not only a subject of rumor and arrest reports, I am a woman, and this is my story." Imagine her, sitting with Dufty, cigarette smoke curling upward, her voice low and husky as she recalled the past, laughter breaking through at one memory, silence descending at another. Perhaps she sipped from a glass as she spoke. Perhaps her hands trembled slightly. Perhaps her eyes drifted to some distant place only she could see. In those sessions, the weight of her life must have pressed heavily, and yet the relief of speaking, of shaping words, offered a kind of release. When the book was published in 1956, it stirred both fascination and controversy. Readers were drawn to the candor, to the glimpse behind the glamour of nightclubs and recording studios. They were shocked by her accounts of abuse, of drug use, of racism's cruelties. Some critics scorned her for admitting so much, others doubted her honesty. Yet many readers heard in the book the same quality they heard in her songs, the truth of feeling, even if the facts shifted. Lady Sings the Blues became not only her story, but part of her myth. It added to the aura of tragedy and scandal that clung to her, but it also gave her a measure of control. She had turned the narrative outward, offering it on her own terms. Whether or not the world believed every word, they could no longer say she had not spoken. And within the book, between the lines, one senses Billie's longing, not merely for sympathy, not merely for recognition, but for understanding. She wanted her listeners, her readers, to know that behind the scandals was a woman who had endured, who had struggled, who had fought to keep singing even when the world tried to silence her. In this, the book succeeds. It does not present a tidy life story. It presents Billie Holiday herself, fractured, resilient, wounded, unbowed. Her songs in these years echoed the same themes. Pieces like Good Morning Heartache and Don't Explain carried the weight of her personal life, blurred into universal truth. The autobiography and the recordings seem to speak to one another, two different languages telling the same story. One in ink, the other in melody, one fixed on a page, the other floating into the air. And yet writing the book did not save her from the struggles that continued. The Bureau still pursued her, her addiction still bound her, her relationships still bruised her. If anything, the attention the book drew made her even more visible to those who sought her downfall. But perhaps she did not write to be saved. Perhaps she wrote simply to bear witness to her own life, to leave behind words as well as notes, so that when her voice faltered, her story would remain. In the hush after a reading of her autobiography, just as in the hush after one of her songs, the listener is left unsettled, uncertain, haunted. Was what she told the truth, or was it a truth shaped by need? Does it matter? The heart recognizes itself in her words, as it does in her music. That is enough. And so the pen rests, the pages close, and Billie steps once more toward the microphone. The autobiography has given her voice on paper, but the world still waits to hear her in song. Her later recordings, cracked and weary, will carry the story forward, each note an echo of the pages she has turned. The applause that greets her as she steps onto the stage after the book's release is tinged with curiosity now, the audience eager to hear not only Lady Day the singer, but Billie Holiday the storyteller of her own life. The final page of Lady Sings the Blues is turned, and from that page rises again the sound of music. Her voice, older now, roughened, yet filled with a truth no ink could fully capture. The final page of Lady Sings the Blues closed like the soft fall of a curtain. Yet even as the ink dried, the truer story continued not in letters, but in sound. Billie returned again to the studio and the stage, her voice no longer supple as in youth, but marked by the years, rasped by smoke, thinned by illness, fractured by nights without rest. And yet, in this very weariness, a new kind of beauty emerged, a beauty that made her late recordings haunting mirrors of her life. The 1950s were not gentle years. Addiction pulled harder, the law still pursued her, and her body bore the toll. But when she sang into the microphone, something remarkable occurred. The flaws of her voice did not diminish her. They deepened her. Every crack, every tremor, every breath that seemed on the edge of collapse became part of the music. She no longer reached for notes with the ease of youth. Instead, she bent them, held them close, let them fall heavy with meaning. It was as though her voice itself had grown into her story. No longer a bright instrument, but a weathered relic carrying the scars of survival. Listeners who expected the sparkling clarity of her early records sometimes recoiled. Critics spoke of decline, of deterioration, of a voice destroyed by abuse. Yet those who listened with their hearts rather than their ears found something greater. They found truth. When Billie sang "You've Changed" in 1958, it was not merely a song of lost love. It was a confession, a lament, the weary acknowledgement of time's cruelty. Her voice cracked and strained, yet in those very imperfections lay its power. She no longer performed for entertainment alone. She performed as if every note were her last. The orchestras she recorded with during these years seemed to recognize this transformation. The arrangements often gave her space, letting her voice float in emptiness, surrounded by quiet horns or gentle piano. Each pause became charged, each silence heavy. The listener leaned forward, drawn into the intimacy of a woman no longer pretending, no longer shielding herself with technique. This was not the Billie of Harlem clubs, eager and fresh. This was Billie at the end of a long road, battered but unbroken, her very survival a kind of defiance. It is tempting to call these recordings tragic, yet to do so is to overlook their resilience. Tragedy suggests final defeat, but Billie's late songs are not defeated. They are weary, yes, but they burn with the quiet fire of endurance. She sings as though saying, "I am still here. My voice may falter, but it speaks. My life may be scarred, but it is mine." The audiences of her late concerts felt this fire. At Carnegie Hall in 1956, she stood before a crowd that filled the grand space, her presence both fragile and commanding. She spoke to them through songs that carried the weight of decades, songs of love, betrayal, hope, despair. Each lyric seemed to draw a line from her past to the present moment, and the hall grew silent, caught in her spell. Applause erupted, thunderous and long, but Billie received it with a faint smile, a slight bow, as though already turned inward, already elsewhere. Her cabaret card had been taken from her years earlier, banning her from the New York clubs where she had built her legend. This exile still pained her, for those small rooms, filled with smoke and intimacy, were her truest home. Concert halls gave her grandeur, but she had always belonged to the closeness of nightclubs, where every listener sat within reach of her sorrow. Yet even denied that space, She carved out moments of communion, proving that no decree could entirely silence her. In the studio, she continued to record, leaving behind albums that would outlast her. Lady in Satin, recorded in 1958, stands as both testament and epitaph. The lush orchestration wrapped her in sweeping strings, but within that grandeur, her voice stood naked, trembling, unvarnished. She sang of lost love, of longing, of regret, and the listener could not help but hear her own life in every phrase. To some, the contrast between the fragile voice and the rich arrangements was jarring. To others, it was devastatingly beautiful. For here was a woman standing at the edge of her life, still offering her heart without disguise. What must she have felt, hearing herself in those recordings? Did she recognize the beauty within the cracks, or did she only hear decline? Did she know she was creating something timeless, or did she believe she was only exposing her weakness? Perhaps she felt both, for Billie was always caught between pride and doubt, between resilience and despair. The truth is that her late voice, more than her youthful one, has become her legacy. It speaks to us across time not of perfection, but of humanity. We hear in it the cost of suffering, the endurance of spirit, the fragility of flesh. We hear a woman who lived too much and too hard, yet who never stopped singing. And so, in these years, her music became more than entertainment. It became testimony. The continuation of the story begun with strange fruit. The world had tried to silence her, to shame her, to strip her of dignity, yet through her cracked voice she spoke louder than ever. She told us that beauty does not lie in flawlessness, but in truth. She showed us that a voice can falter and still pierce the heart more deeply than any polished tone. The applause that followed these performances carried a different quality than before. It was not only admiration, but reverence, as though the audience understood they were witnessing not mere talent, but the endurance of a soul. The silences between songs grew longer, as if listeners needed to gather themselves, to wipe their eyes, to breathe again. And Billie, weary, often smiled faintly, as though she knew she had given all she could and more. But as the final notes of these late recordings faded, shadows loomed. Her health was failing, her addictions relentless, the authorities unyielding. The very act of singing became both salvation and torment, a brief escape from silence and yet a reminder of how close silence had come. Each concert, each studio session carried with it the possibility of being her last. And perhaps she felt it. Perhaps she knew that time was running thin. One evening, after a recording session, she stepped out into the night once more. The city hummed around her, indifferent to her weariness, yet within her still burned the ember of song. She walked slowly, her coat pulled close, her eyes distant. The applause still rang faintly in her ears, but beyond the door lay the cold reality of trials and prison cells. The stage could hold her, but the law still hunted her. And so from the fading strains of music rose once more the harsh echo of judgment, waiting to claim her voice again. The cold echo of judgment followed her out of the studio doors, louder than applause, sharper than any critic's word. The law still hunted her, and in the 1940s and 1950s, its grip grew unrelenting. For Billie Holiday, the stage was her sanctuary, but the courtroom became an unwilling stage of another kind, a place where her name was called not in celebration, but in accusation. The judges and agents cared nothing for the beauty of her voice. To them she was not Lady Day, not the woman who had sung truth into silence, but only a mark to be broken, a symbol to be subdued. Her arrests came suddenly, often cruelly. Agents burst into hotel rooms, ransacked her belongings, cornered her in clubs. They waited until she faltered, until her weakness showed, then pounced. Newspapers devoured the spectacle, splashing her name across headlines, turning her private agony into public entertainment. Jazz singer arrested on drug charge, they wrote, as though her life could be reduced to scandal in bold letters. The crowds who had once risen in ovation read the stories with fascination, pity, or scorn. To the Bureau, each headline was victory, each photograph of her in handcuffs a warning to others. Her first major trial came in 1947. In a federal courtroom she stood, small and weary, her voice trembling not with song but with fear. The prosecutor painted her as a criminal, the judge pronounced her guilty, and the sentence fell, a year and a day in a West Virginia prison. For Billie, it was not only the loss of freedom, but the loss of dignity. To be caged like an animal, stripped of the stage that gave her life, was a wound deeper than any drug or betrayal had inflicted. She endured it, counting the days, her mind restless with memory, her body restless with need. When at last she emerged, she returned to New York, hoping to rebuild, to reclaim the sanctuary of music. But the punishment did not end at the prison gate. The city, in its bureaucratic cruelty, denied her a cabaret card, the license required for any performer in venues that served alcohol. In a city of nightclubs, this was a death sentence for a singer. The very spaces that had shaped her, the intimate rooms where her voice belonged, were now forbidden. To sing in them would mean arrest. She was forced to turn to concert halls where her fame still drew crowds, but the difference was profound. In the grand halls, the distance between singer and listener widened. The lights blinded, the sound magnified, the formality stifled the intimacy that had always been her gift. She sang still with truth, but something essential was missing. The closeness of a room where the audience could feel her breath, see her tears, sense her wounds. Stripped of that, she felt exiled from her own home. The law's hand did not loosen. Agents continued to harass her, following her from city to city, ensuring she remained under watch. More arrests came, more humiliation. In Philadelphia in 1956, in San Francisco in 1949, again and again she was dragged into custody. Her name stained anew. Each time she was forced to stand in court, her voice unheard, her life reduced to evidence and testimony. Each time the authorities declared themselves victorious, they believed they had broken her. Yet each time, when she returned to the microphone, her voice still rose. Quieter, perhaps, wearier, but unextinguished. What must she have felt in those courtrooms, standing small before robed judges, her fate in their hands? Did she think of Baltimore, of the streets where she had first learned what survival meant? Did she recall Harlem, where applause once shielded her from all else? Or did she feel only the weight of chains, the endless circle of accusation and punishment? Perhaps she thought of none of these and simply endured, moment by moment, as she had done all her life. The paradox of her existence grew sharper. On stage, she was revered, her songs etched into memory. Off stage, she was hounded, her body shackled, her life torn apart. She was celebrated as an artist and condemned as a sinner, applauded by the same society that relished her downfall. To live in such contradiction is to live always at the edge of despair. And yet, in the music of those years, one hears not surrender, but defiance. In recordings made after her prison release, there is a tone of bitterness, yes, but also of endurance. She sang as though to declare, "You may chain me, but you cannot silence me. You may strip me of licenses, but you cannot strip me of my song." Each performance became a quiet act of rebellion against the system that sought to erase her. The silence that followed these performances carried with it a new quality. It was no longer only awe or grief or unease. It was respect, a recognition that this woman, who had been so battered, still stood, still sang, still gave herself to her listeners. The applause erupted like waves, but beneath it was a deeper acknowledgement. They were witnessing not only an artist, but a survivor. And yet survival has its limits. Each trial, each arrest, each humiliation carved into her spirit eroded her strength. Addiction tightened its hold, lovers bruised her, money slipped away, health declined. The law had succeeded in part. They had weakened her, diminished her, scarred her, But they had not silenced her, not entirely. Picture her stepping out of a courthouse, cameras flashing, reporters shouting, policemen pressing close. She keeps her head lowered, her coat drawn tight, her eyes shadowed. To the world, she is a spectacle. To herself, perhaps, she is only tired. Yet that night or the next, she steps again onto a stage, and as the lights rise, she gives to the audience not her scandal, but her soul. The final note of one concert lingers, trembling in the air. The crowd rises, applauds, calls her name. But when the lights dim and she leaves the stage, the silence that greets her is not filled with love. It is filled with the emptiness of hotel rooms, with the sound of a knock at the door that could be lover, friend, or agent. And so her life moved forward, not toward peace, but toward deeper struggle. Each song a light in the gathering dark. The silence of hotel rooms and the echo of courthouse steps seemed to weigh upon her shoulders. Yet even within this gloom, there were moments when the light broke through, when applause lifted her once more into radiance. For Billie Holiday, the late 1940s and 1950s were not only years of decline and persecution, but also of unexpected comebacks, flashes of brilliance that reminded the world, and perhaps reminded her, that her flame had not yet gone out. One such moment came in 1948, when she stepped onto the stage of Carnegie Hall. The great hall, with its golden tiers and hushed reverence, was a far cry from the smoke-thick clubs of Harlem where she had first sung. Here the audience came not for dancing or drinking, but to listen, to be still, to receive. And as Billie walked into the light, still weary from prison, still scarred by scandal, she carried herself with a quiet dignity. The orchestra waited. The crowd leaned forward, and when she began to sing, the hall transformed. Her voice was not as it had been in her youth. It carried cracks, tremors, rough edges that no training could smooth. But in that space, those flaws became virtues. Every imperfection told a story. Every rasp carried memory. The audience was not hearing mere notes. They were hearing a life lived, a soul worn and still burning. The applause that followed shook the hall, waves of sound rising and rising, as though to reassure her that despite all she had endured, she was still theirs, still Lady Day. For Billie, that night was a kind of vindication. The law could strip her of licenses, critics could scorn her, lovers could betray her, but the audience still listened. They still wept at her songs, still applauded until their hands ached. She gave herself to them, and they returned to her what the world so often denied: respect, reverence, love. These concerts did not erase her struggles. The nights still brought loneliness, the mornings still brought sickness, the agents still watched. But they offered glimpses of what might have been had life been kinder, had the world embraced her without cruelty. Each time she stood in such a hall, she proved to herself and to others that her voice, though battered, still carried a truth no persecution could silence. In the studio, too, she found glimmers of return. Recording sessions brought forth albums that revealed her late style in all its haunting beauty. Songs for distingué lovers, Stay With Me, Velvet Mood, titles that now seem like fragments of a larger confession. Her voice was not smooth. It wavered, it sighed, it broke. But in those breaks lay her genius. She no longer sought to dazzle. She sought only to tell the truth, and truth in her hands became luminous. Her partnership with Lester Young, though strained in later years by their separate struggles, occasionally rekindled. When the two reunited on stage, their bond was still evident. His saxophone lines curled around her voice as though shielding it, and she responded with tenderness that words could not capture. Audiences sensed the depth of their connection, a musical marriage that endured even as time and addiction took their toll. Lester had called her Lady Day. She had called him Prez. Those names still carried warmth, even in decline. But behind these triumphs lay shadows that would not lift. Money slipped through her fingers, squandered by others or lost to the costs of addiction. Lovers came and went, some leaving bruises, others leaving debts. The Bureau's watch never ended, and each step forward seemed followed by a stumble back. Yet Billie, in her stubborn way, refused to give up the stage. She performed wherever she could. Europe welcomed her when America turned cold, and she found in foreign cities audiences who revered her without the same weight of scandal. Paris, London, Stockholm, these stages embraced her, and for a moment she was free. Still, even these journeys could not shield her from the decline within her body. Illness crept closer, her liver failing, her heart strained. She grew thinner, her energy waned, and some nights she struggled to finish a set. Audiences noticed, but many forgave. They came not for perfection, but for presence, not for flawless notes, but for the woman who had lived every line she sang. In her frailty, they found their own frailty reflected, and in her endurance, they found hope. Perhaps the greatest paradox of these years was that her weakest voice carried her strongest truth. Critics who once scorned her late style now speak of its depth, its humanity. To hear Billie Holiday in her final decade is not to hear a singer at her peak of technical skill. It is to hear a human being laying bare the cost of life, of love, of struggle. That is why her recordings endure, not because they are perfect, but because they are true. One imagines her after a concert, weary yet radiant, the applause still ringing in her ears. She walks slowly backstage, the gown heavy on her shoulders, the flowers fragrant in her hands. Musicians smile, friends embrace her, but she is already drifting into solitude, already feeling the ache in her body, already longing for rest. She takes a cigarette, perhaps a drink, perhaps something stronger, and the glow of triumph fades into the shadows once more. And yet, even knowing that the shadows awaited, she returned again and again to the stage. Why? Perhaps because it was the only place she truly lived, the only place where she was not hunted, not bruised, not diminished. On stage, she was Lady Day, and for an hour the world listened. That was enough to keep her walking forward, enough to keep her voice alive. The applause at Carnegie Hall, the ovations in Europe, the reverence of audiences who wept as she sang. These were her glimmers of return, brief flames against the gathering dark. But when the music stopped, when the hall emptied, when the hotel door closed behind her, the silence returned, heavy as ever. The law still hovered, addiction still gnawed, health still waned. And so, as the glow of triumph faded, the shadows of decline stepped forward once more, ready to claim her. The glow of triumph faded, as triumph always does, and into the space it left the shadows crept more boldly. Her body, long battered by years of strain, began to betray her. The late 1950s found Billie Holiday weakened, her liver swollen, her skin sallow, her strength ebbing. She sang still, but the effort showed. Each performance carried not only the weight of her art, but the burden of illness pressing against her chest, tightening her breath, slowing her steps. The applause still came, but those who looked closely could see the shadow of death moving nearer. By the spring of 1959, the toll could no longer be hidden. Collapses came more often. Hospital visits became unavoidable. On May 31st, she was admitted to Metropolitan Hospital in New York. The diagnosis was grim: cirrhosis of the liver, heart disease, fluid in the lungs. Her body had been carrying too much for too long, and now it could carry no more. For a woman whose life had always been lived in public, it is perhaps fitting and tragic that her final days, too, unfolded before the eyes of the world. The hospital room was small, the sheets stiff, the walls plain. Outside, the city pulsed with summer life, indifferent to the suffering inside. Visitors came and went, friends, fellow musicians, admirers who wished to pay respect. They found her frail, her voice reduced to whispers, her frame thin, her eyes still carrying that familiar distant light. She was 44 years old, but time had aged her more than twice that. Yet even here, at the edge of life, the cruelty of the law did not loosen. Federal agents arrived at her bedside, placed her under arrest, and stationed guards at her door. They claimed she had been found with heroin. Whether truth or excuse hardly mattered. They seized her savings, leaving her destitute in her final weeks. And so Billie Holiday, who had sung truth into silence, who had carried the sorrow of her people in her voice, spent her last days not as a legend, honored, but as a prisoner, watched. There is a cruelty almost unspeakable in this image. A dying woman handcuffed to her bed, her veins failing, her breath shallow, and yet still treated as though she might rise and flee. The agents stood watch, but what were they guarding against? Not escape. Billie could not even walk unaided. Perhaps they guarded against the truth her life revealed, that in their pursuit of her, they had sought to silence more than addiction. They had sought to silence defiance itself. Friends protested, journalists condemned, but the authorities did not relent until the very end. Only when her condition grew hopeless did they remove the handcuffs. By then, the damage was done. She knew she was leaving this world not as a free woman, but as one still bound. And yet, within this darkness, moments of tenderness flickered. Musicians who had played with her came to sit quietly at her side. They remembered the nights of music, the laughter backstage, the warmth of her presence. Some held her hand, some wept. Fans sent flowers, filling the small room with fragrance, as though to remind her of the stage she had once adorned with a garden pinned to her hair. Nurses, moved by her plight, spoke gently to her, offering what comfort they could. What thoughts filled her mind in those final days? Did she drift back to Baltimore, to the cracked sidewalks where her story began? Did she recall Harlem's clubs, the applause of strangers, the first thrill of recognition? Did she hear again Lester Young's saxophone wrapping around her voice, or remember the stillness of cafe society when strange fruit first silenced the crowd? Or did she think only of the present, the pain in her body, the chain on her wrist, the faces at her bedside? We cannot know, but we can imagine her memories rising and fading like fragments of song, unfinished, unresolved. On July 17, 1959, the final silence came. The hospital room was dim, the city outside alive with its endless motion. But within, Billie Holiday's breath ceased. 44 years had carried her from the poverty of Baltimore to the heights of international acclaim, from applause to handcuffs, from songs of love to songs of defiance. Her body was gone, but her voice remained, etched into records, echoing through radios, lingering in the memory of all who had heard her. The newspapers announced her death with headlines that mingled scandal and sorrow. Some focused on addiction, on disgrace. Others honored her genius, her artistry, her courage. Crowds gathered to mourn, musicians played in her memory, and the world paused, however briefly, to reflect on the loss of a woman who had sung so deeply of its wounds. And yet, even in death, contradictions clung to her. She was celebrated and condemned, pitied and revered. To some, she was a tragic figure undone by vice. To others, a martyr of injustice, crushed by a system that sought to silence her voice. To those who loved her music, she was simply Billie Holiday, Lady Day, whose songs would never die. The silence in the hospital room did not end her story. It carried outward into the streets, into the homes where her records spun, into the memories of listeners who felt her presence as though she still sang. That silence was filled with echoes, with questions, with the lingering truth of her life. And from that silence arises a need to look backward once more, to trace the thread from beginning to end. For Billie Holiday's death was not only an end but a return to the girl she once was, to the roots of her suffering and her song. To understand the silence of 1959, one must remember the voices of Baltimore in 1915, the cracked sidewalks, the restless search for belonging. The story had come full circle, though no circle could contain its depth. The applause of Carnegie Hall, the stillness of cafe society, the laughter of Harlem nights, the whispers of lovers, the cries of jail cells, the crackle of records, all lingered as fragments around her. They do not vanish. They remain, carried forward by memory, by song, by the voices of those who still listen. And so the hospital fades into silence, and in its place rises again the memory of her beginnings. A small child in Baltimore, walking streets littered with dust and promise, unaware of the weight she would one day carry, unaware of the voice that would change the world. The hospital faded into silence, and in its place rose again the memory of her beginnings. A small child in Baltimore, wandering cracked sidewalks, unaware of the weight she would one day carry, unaware of the voice that would carry her name across oceans. Death, in its strange way, invites the circle to close, invites us to look backward and see the thread that binds the beginning to the end. For Billie Holiday's story did not begin in applause, nor in scandal, nor even in song. It began in hunger, in neglect, in the uncertain arms of a teenage mother, and the absence of a father who drifted like smoke. Eleanora Fagan, the girl who would become Billie Holiday, was born in 1915 into a world already stacked against her. Poverty was the soil in which she grew, and hardship the air she breathed. Her mother, Sadie, was little more than a girl herself, struggling to survive. Her father, Clarence, pursued his own restless life in music, appearing rarely, leaving behind more longing than comfort. The child who toddled through those narrow Baltimore streets was not expected to shine, not expected to rise beyond her surroundings. Yet within her was already a spark, though hidden, though unrecognized, waiting to find its voice. As she grew, the world gave her little mercy. Abuse scarred her, poverty pressed upon her, loneliness carved deep furrows in her heart. She was sent to reform school, punished not for crime but for being a child too difficult to contain, a girl without the protection of wealth or family. She learned early that tenderness was rare, and that to endure one must bend, must hide pain within. In these beginnings lay the roots of her later music, for each song she would one day sing carried the weight of those early sorrows. Yet even amid hardship, there were sounds that lifted her. From gramophones and radios came the voices of Louis Armstrong and Bessie Smith, carrying warmth, defiance, power. Young Billie listened with rapt attention, imitating, absorbing, dreaming. Perhaps she sensed, in their notes, a doorway opening. Perhaps she felt that music could be not only escape, but transformation, that through song one could survive what life denied. Her mother's move to Harlem brought her into a new world, vibrant with music, alive with rhythm. Harlem in the 1920s and 1930s was a crucible of art, where the streets pulsed with energy and the clubs glowed with promise. For Billie, the move was both an escape and a new struggle. The poverty followed, the dangers remained, yet now the air was alive with possibility. She worked in menial jobs, she wandered the streets, and slowly, cautiously, she began to sing. The girl from Baltimore stepped into Harlem's clubs, at first with hesitation, then with growing confidence. Her voice was not trained, not polished, but it carried something rarer, truth. She bent notes, stretched words, made each song her own. The audiences noticed, musicians took note, and soon the spark within her ignited. She was no longer only Eleanora. She became Billie Holiday Lady Day, a name that would travel far beyond the streets where she was born. The arc from that child to the woman in the hospital bed is long and jagged, marked by triumph and wound alike. She sang with Basie and Shaw, she stood in cafe society and gave the world strange fruit. She recorded songs that remain etched in memory. She was applauded by crowds, honored by critics, revered by musicians. And yet, at the same time, she was hunted by the law, exploited by lovers, betrayed by friends, undone by addiction. The circle of her life was woven from contradiction, beauty and brutality bound so tightly that they could not be separated. When we look back upon her, we cannot help but ask, was this tragedy her fate from the beginning? Was she doomed by the poverty of her birth, the absence of protection, the prejudice of her world? Or was there, within her, some inevitability of defiance, some spark that demanded to burn even if it consumed her? Did she inherit her suffering, or did she create beauty from it? The questions hang, unanswered, like the final note of a song that fades but never resolves. Her story, when seen whole, is not only the story of an individual, but of a time, a nation, a people. She carried in her voice the grief of those silenced, the longing of those denied justice, the hope of those who endured. When she sang of heartbreak, it was not only her own. When she sang strange fruit, it was not only protest, but embodiment of pain that stretched far beyond her. In this sense, Billie Holiday was more than herself. She was a vessel, and through her voice flowed the sorrows and defiance of many. And yet she was also only herself, a woman who longed for love, who sought tenderness, who made mistakes, who endured bruises and betrayals. To turn her into symbol alone is to erase her humanity. She was not only Lady Day, not only the haunting voice of jazz. She was Billie, the girl from Baltimore who laughed, who wept, who reached for a needle in despair, who reached for a microphone in hope. The circle brings us back to that small child walking a Baltimore street, hearing distant strains of music from a window. She could not know that her life would end in a hospital bed with guards at her door. She could not know that she would sing songs that shook a nation, that her name would become legend. She knew only hunger, only hardship, only the longing for something more. And yet within her, even then, was the seed of the voice that would carry her story into eternity. The silence of her death in 1959 is thus filled with echoes of her birth in 1915. The arc between them is not straight, not smooth, but jagged, fractured, luminous. To trace it is to see both the cruelty of fate and the resilience of spirit. Billie Holiday did not escape her suffering. She did not find peace in life, but she transformed her wounds into song, and in that transformation, she gave the world a gift that endures beyond her. The applause that greeted her at Carnegie Hall, the silence that followed Strange Fruit, the tears of listeners who heard in her voice their own unspoken sorrow. These remain. They carry her beyond death, beyond scandal, beyond the chains that bound her. And so, as we return to her beginnings, we do not end her story. We prepare to listen again, to hear how each song was itself a chapter, each lyric a reflection, each melody a fragment of biography. The cracked sidewalks of Baltimore fade, and in their place rises the echo of music. Her songs themselves, each one a piece of her life, each one carrying meaning beyond the notes. To understand Billie Holiday, we must listen not only to her story, but to her songs, for in them lies her truest autobiography. The cracked sidewalks of Baltimore fade, and in their place rises the echo of music, the very songs she left behind. For if her autobiography on the printed page was fractured and uncertain, her true diary was always her voice. Each song she sang carried more than melody. It carried memory, confession, testimony. To listen to Billie Holiday is to read the journal she never kept, the diary she etched into the air with every trembling note. Take, for instance, God Bless the Child. Written after an argument with her mother about money, it became one of her most enduring works. The lyric tells of a world where the strong thrive and the weak are left behind, where them that's got shall get, them that's not shall lose. When Billie sang it, it was not abstract observation, but lived truth. She had known hunger as a child, betrayal as an adult, and the bitterness of those who turned their backs when she had nothing to give. In her phrasing, one hears not only complaint but resignation, the weary acknowledgement that life itself is unequal. And yet within the song, there is also defiance, a refusal to beg, a declaration of self-reliance even when the world withholds kindness. It is as though she were writing in her diary, "I have been abandoned, but I will endure." Another page of that diary is found in Don't Explain. Legend tells that her then-lover came home with traces of another woman on him, and rather than rage, she wrote this song. Its lyric does not shout, does not accuse. It sighs. Don't explain, it says, "You're my joy and pain." In these words lies the paradox of her loves, the resignation to betrayal coupled with the inability to let go. When she sang it, her voice draped itself around the lines like a weary embrace, forgiving even as it mourned. It is the sound of a woman too tired to fight, who chooses love even in its broken form. No written memoir could capture her relationship so clearly. In this song, the truth is laid bare. Love wounded her, and yet she could not stop seeking it. Then there is Good Morning, Heartache, a song that greets sorrow as though it were an old companion. In her delivery, the words feel less like lyrics and more like a whispered confession to herself. She had lived so long with grief, with loss, with disappointment, that heartache had indeed become familiar. She sang not with bitterness but with recognition, as though saying, "You are still here, and I know you, and I will go on despite you." The diary entry here is not dramatic, but intimate. It tells of endurance, of the quiet strength to rise each morning even when the night has been filled with despair. Each of these songs is more than performance. They are entries written in the ink of her voice, the ink of breath and sorrow. Together, they form a biography more faithful than any book. Listen closely and you will hear her childhood hunger in God Bless the Child, her bruised relationships in Don't Explain, her lifelong companionship with sorrow in Good Morning, Heartache. No critic, no historian, no journalist could tell her story with such clarity as she herself told it in these recordings. Even songs not born from her own pen became autobiographical in her singing. Give Billie any lyric, and she would bend it to her life. A love song became a confession. A playful tune became tinged with irony. A simple melody became layered with memory. She did not interpret songs. She inhabited them, transformed them, made them her own. That is why listeners still feel her presence, why her recordings remain haunting decades after her death. It is not only the music they hear, but the life within it. And so her discography is a kind of diary, but one without order, without chronology. The entries are scattered, each song a fragment a mirror of a moment, an emotion, a wound. Taken together, they form a mosaic of her life, incomplete yet revealing. To trace them is to walk alongside her, to hear her thoughts unspoken, to feel her emotions unguarded. Imagine her in the studio, standing before a microphone, the musicians waiting. She closes her eyes, tilts her head slightly, and lets the first note fall. Around her, the band plays, but the listener hears only her. In that moment, she is not performing for the crowd, not entertaining for applause. She is writing in her diary, writing with her voice, leaving behind words too heavy to speak. The tape spins, the red light glows, and history is preserved, not as fact, but as feeling. This diary of song reveals truths the world preferred to overlook. It tells of poverty, of racism, of injustice, of the longing for love, of the betrayal of trust, of the endurance of hope. It tells of a woman who lived too hard, too fast, yet who refused to surrender her voice. It tells of a nation that applauded her and imprisoned her, adored her music and condemned her life. Listening now, one might ask, did she know, when she recorded these songs, that she was leaving behind her truest legacy? Did she sense that her cracked voice would one day be studied, revered, cherished? Or did she simply sing because she could not do otherwise, because silence was unbearable, because singing was the only way she knew to live? Perhaps it was both. Perhaps she felt the weight of history even as she reached for the next note. Her songs remain long after the clubs closed, long after the hospital bed grew cold. They remain as living fragments, pages of the diary she never wrote, entries that cannot fade because they are sung. Each time a listener places the record on the turntable, each time her voice spills into a room, the diary is opened again, the entries reread, the life remembered. And so, from the silence of Baltimore's streets, from the silence of the hospital room, rises the music once more. It carries us forward and backward at once, binding past and present, binding the child and the woman, binding hunger and applause. It reminds us that Billie Holiday's story is not only written in biography or history, it is written in the breath she left behind, in the tremble of her phrasing, in the ache of her voice. The final note of one recording fades, the stylus lifting from the groove, the air suddenly empty. In that emptiness lies the next question. What became of her after death? How the world gathered to mourn her, and how her absence became as powerful as her presence. The stylus lifted from the groove, the air grew empty, and into that emptiness came grief. The summer of 1959 carried news that spread quickly through the streets, across radios, into newspapers. Billie Holiday was gone. She had left the hospital bed, the handcuffs, the silence of suffering, and now what remained was only memory. Yet memory is never silent. It stirs, it whispers, it calls forth voices. And so the world, in its own way, began to sing her absence. News of her death reached Harlem first, where she had once wandered as a young girl chasing sound. Clubs fell quiet. Musicians paused, instruments in hand, struck not by surprise. Many had known the end was near, but by the finality of it. To know Billie was failing was one thing. To know Billie was gone was another. In apartments and crowded bars, her records spun as though to ward off the silence, as though her voice might keep her alive. In the days that followed, thousands came to pay their respects. Her funeral was held in New York, and the crowd that gathered was immense. They filed past her coffin, some weeping openly, others silent in reverence. Among them were musicians who had shared stages with her, who had felt the warmth of her voice wrapping around their notes. They came to honor not only a singer, but a companion, a fellow traveler through the hard roads of jazz. The pallbearers included some of the greatest names of her generation. They carried her body with care, as though carrying not only a woman but an era, as though each step marked the passing of something larger than one life. Lester Young, her beloved Prez, had died only a few months before, and many whispered that the two had been bound together in death as in music, their voices entwined in memory as they had been on stage. The funeral service was filled with song. Musicians played her favorites, voices rose in tribute, and for a moment the grief of loss was transformed into the beauty of remembrance. Yet beneath the music lay sorrow. For many, Billie's death was not only the loss of a friend or idol, but a reminder of the cruelty she had endured, the poverty, the racism, the persecution, the handcuffs on her deathbed. To mourn her was also to mourn the injustice of a world that could not protect its brightest flame. Newspapers printed her story in stark headlines. Some honored her artistry, celebrating her as the voice of a generation, the woman who had given jazz its deepest soul. Others, less kind, emphasized scandal, addiction, the law. Even in death, Billie Holiday could not escape contradiction. She was saint and sinner, genius and fallen woman, martyr and misfit. The public devoured all versions, constructing from her absence a myth larger than the life she had lived. Yet in homes, away from headlines, the mourning was quieter, more personal. A record placed gently on the turntable, a song listened to in solitude, a tear wiped away in the half-light of a room. For each listener, Billie had been more than celebrity. She had been confidant, companion, voice of sorrows unspoken. To lose her was to lose someone who had always been there, whispering truth into their darkness. The days turned to weeks, and the funeral faded into memory, but the myth grew. Billie Holiday became not only a singer, but a legend, her life retold in stories both true and embellished. Some spoke of her as a tragic heroine, destroyed by her own flaws. Others framed her as a victim of cruelty, a martyr to injustice. Still others saw her simply as an artist whose voice transcended her wounds. Each version contained some truth, yet none contained all. For the fullness of Billie Holiday was more complex, more human than myth could capture. And yet myths serve their purpose. They carry memory forward. They preserve names beyond their time. In the years that followed, Billie's myth ensured her survival. Young singers imitated her phrasing, jazz lovers treasured her records, writers and filmmakers wove her story into art. She was gone, and yet she was everywhere. In smoky bars where her songs still played, in concert halls where others sang her name, in the quiet of homes where listeners placed her record on the spindle and sat in silence as her voice rose once more. Her absence became presence. Each note she had left behind grew heavier with meaning. Songs like Strange Fruit, God Bless the Child, Good Morning Heartache were no longer only performances. They became monuments, testaments, relics of a life both luminous and broken. To hear them after her death was to hear not only Billie's voice but her ghost, reminding the world of the cost of beauty and the price of truth. In time, the grief of her death softened, as grief always does. But the legend only grew stronger. Billie Holiday became timeless, her name etched among the immortals of music. She had lived only 44 years, but those years stretched far beyond themselves, echoing in every singer who bent a note, in every audience that paused to listen. Still, one must ask, what if she had lived longer? What songs might she have sung? What wisdom might she have shared? What peace might she have found? These questions linger, unanswered, haunting. Perhaps the tragedy of her early death fed the myth, ensuring she would forever be remembered as a voice cut short, a flame extinguished too soon. Perhaps if she had lived into old age, the world would have grown accustomed, taken her for granted, allowed her to fade quietly. But we cannot know. We can only mourn what was lost and treasure what remains. The stylus lowers again, a record spins, and her voice fills the room. The listener feels the presence of absence, the intimacy of someone no longer living yet impossibly near. That is the gift of music, to defy death, to preserve breath, to let the voice speak across time. And Billie Holiday, though gone, continues to speak. The coffin was lowered, the crowd dispersed, the flowers wilted, but the music endured. Out of the silence of death came the echo of her voice, and that echo has never stopped. It lingers still, reminding us that though her body was claimed by illness and cruelty, her spirit remains in song. And so, from the mourning crowd, from the silence of the funeral, we turn toward the ripple her voice left in the world beyond her life, the singers who followed, the generations she shaped, the echo of her style in the very language of jazz. From the mourning crowd, from the silence of the funeral, rose the ripple of her voice carried into the world beyond her life. Billie Holiday was gone, but the echo of her style lingered in the air like smoke that refuses to disperse. Her phrasing, her intimacy, her fragile yet unyielding tone became part of the language of jazz itself. Every singer who came after her felt the presence of Lady Day, whether they acknowledged it or not. She had not merely sung songs, she had reshaped the very way songs could be sung. Ella Fitzgerald, her contemporary and friend, often spoke of Billie with reverence. Ella's voice was brighter, smoother, more agile, filled with scat runs and playful brilliance, yet she admired in Billie the quality that no technical skill could replicate: honesty. When Ella sang, she dazzled with clarity. When Billie sang, she disarmed with truth. They occupied different corners of jazz, yet Ella's respect ensured that Billie's legacy did not fade. She told listeners and fellow musicians alike that Lady Day was one of the greats, reminding the world that artistry was not measured only in range or technique, but in the ability to make a listener feel. Nina Simone, coming into prominence in the years after Billie's death, carried forward the spirit of defiance that had marked Strange Fruit. Simone's voice was deeper, more commanding, but in her protest songs one hears the lineage of Billie Holiday. Nina sang of injustice, of the wounds of race and poverty, of the need to speak truth even when silence was safer. Though Nina often used piano and arrangement to heighten her message, Billie had shown the way, that a single voice trembling with emotion could shift an entire room into silence. Simone once said that an artist's duty was to reflect the times. Billie had done this before her, with a quiet courage that left its mark. In the decades that followed, younger voices continued to echo Billie's influence. In the smoky clubs of the 1960s and 1970s, singers leaned into phrasing that bent time, that stretched words, that spoke rather than merely sang. They may not have consciously imitated her, but the language she created had become part of the air. Jazz itself was never the same after her, for she had shown that imperfection could be beauty, that fragility could be strength, that the smallest voice could carry the greatest truth. Even in the late 20th century, as jazz gave way to soul, blues, and popular music, Billie's presence remained. Artists as different as Janis Joplin with her raw rasp and Amy Winehouse with her aching intimacy owed debts to Billie's style. Amy in particular spoke openly of Lady Day's influence. Her own songs of love, addiction, and despair seemed to mirror Billie's life, and listeners often remarked on the resemblance of their voices: husky, vulnerable, broken, yet magnetic. When Amy, too, died young, many drew the line back to Billie, seeing in her story a modern echo of the same cycle of brilliance and tragedy. Why does her influence linger so powerfully? Perhaps because Billie Holiday taught that singing was not about displaying perfection, but about revealing humanity. She stripped away the artifice, the polish, the glitter, and left only the raw core of feeling. In a world that so often prizes glamour over truth, her voice remains a reminder that the greatest art is often the most wounded. She sang as though whispering directly into the listener's ear, making each person feel as though she spoke only to them. This intimacy became the model for generations of singers who sought connection rather than grandeur. Musicians, too, felt her touch. Lester Young's saxophone had once wrapped around her voice, and the interplay between instrument and singer became a template for jazz phrasing itself. Horn players studied the way she delayed a note, the way she slid behind the beat, the way she lingered in spaces that others rushed through. Pianists and bassists adjusted to her phrasing, learning to bend with her rather than force her into strict rhythm. This flexibility became part of jazz language, carried forward by countless players who may not even have realized they were following her. Beyond music, Billie's life itself became a symbol. Writers, playwrights, filmmakers drew upon her story, seeing in it the archetype of the tragic artist undone by genius and wound. Some reduced her to cliché, others honored her complexity, but all agreed that her presence could not be ignored. She had become myth even in life. In death, the myth only deepened. And yet, amid the myth and influence, the woman herself remained elusive. Each generation that invoked her name carried its own version of Billie Holiday. For some, she was the patron saint of suffering, her cracked voice the anthem of broken hearts. For others, she was the bold protester, the singer who dared to confront lynching in Strange Fruit. For still others, she was the embodiment of jazz itself, its improvisation, its intimacy, its refusal to bow to rules. Perhaps she was all of these, and perhaps she was none. What is certain is that no one could sing after Billie without, in some way, singing with her. Imagine a young singer in the decades after her death, standing nervous before a microphone, the band waiting. The singer breathes, begins to sing, and unconsciously delays a phrase, lets the word sag with emotion, bends a note until it almost breaks. In that gesture, Billie Holiday lives again. The singer may never have studied her, may not even realize the echo, but the echo is there, embedded in the very fabric of jazz, in the very way we understand how to sing. Thus, her influence is not only direct but atmospheric, woven into the air of music itself. To sing jazz after 1939 is to sing in a world shaped by Lady Day. To sing of sorrow is to follow the path she carved. To pause after a line and let silence speak is to borrow from her diary of sound. Even those who do not know her name have felt her presence, for the language she created has become common speech. And so the echo ripples outward still, beyond Ella, beyond Nina, beyond Amy, beyond the boundaries of jazz. It lingers in blues, in soul, in pop ballads where intimacy outweighs perfection. It lingers in every voice that chooses truth over gloss, confession over display. Billie Holiday's legacy is not only her recordings, it is the way she taught the world to listen differently, to value fragility as strength, to embrace imperfection as beauty. From the funeral silence of 1959, her voice continues to resound, reshaping generations, whispering through the voices of those who followed. And as that echo fades into the present moment, we turn not only to her influence, but to the myth that grew around her, the stories told and retold until Lady Day became not merely a woman or a singer, but a figure larger than life itself. From the echo of her influence, from the voices of those who sang in her shadow, arose something else, something less tangible, yet just as enduring. Billie Holiday became myth. The woman who once walked Baltimore streets, who once sang in Harlem's smoky rooms, who once lay handcuffed in a hospital bed, was reshaped in the minds of those who came after. She became not only Billie, not only Lady Day, but a figure larger than life, a symbol, a legend. And legends, once born, are not easily separated from truth. The myth began even before her death, for newspapers and gossip had long painted her life as tragedy. The headlines emphasized scandal, addiction, downfall. They told of arrests, of lovers who betrayed, of nights when she stumbled on stage. Even as she still sang, she was already becoming a story to be told rather than a person to be understood. When death came in 1959, it sealed the tale. No longer could she contradict it. No longer could she shape her own narrative. The world, eager for symbols, took her life and molded it into parable. Biographies appeared, some reverent, some sensational. Writers sought to explain her, to capture her essence, to claim they knew what she had felt, what she had meant. Some leaned on her autobiography, Lady Sings the Blues, though its mix of truth and invention made it as much art as document. Others crafted their own interpretations, emphasizing certain episodes, ignoring others, shaping her life into the image of the tragic artist undone by vice. In these retellings, Billie was often stripped of her complexity. She became the doomed woman with the beautiful voice, the fragile flower crushed by a cruel world. Plays and films followed. On stage and screen, actresses portrayed her life, often leaning heavily on the narrative of decline and despair. The most famous adaptation, Lady Sings the Blues with Diana Ross in 1972, brought her story to a new generation. Ross's performance, luminous and moving, earned accolades, and for many viewers, this became the Billie Holiday they knew. Yet the film, like so many retellings, shaped reality into drama, bending events to fit the arc of tragedy. It gave audiences what they expected, the rise, the scandal, the fall, while leaving aside the quieter truths, the moments of humor, the resilience, the sheer ordinariness that had also filled Billie's days. The myth served a purpose. It preserved her name, ensured that she would not be forgotten, kept her in public memory. But myths also distort. They reduce the human into symbol, the complex into simple, the real into archetype. And so Billie Holiday became, in cultural memory, the tragic heroine, the saint of sorrow, the angel of suffering. This image, though powerful, risks silencing the fuller truth of her life. Why do we prefer her as myth rather than woman? Perhaps because the myth comforts us. To frame her as tragic heroine allows us to weep for her while keeping her at a distance, to admire her voice while absolving ourselves of responsibility for the world that harmed her. It is easier to say she was doomed by her own flaws than to confront the racism, the sexism, the cruelty of a system that pursued her relentlessly. It is easier to cast her as fallen angel than to reckon with how we failed to protect her. And yet, beneath the myth, the woman remains. In recordings, one hears her laugh softly between takes. One hears her banter with musicians. One hears not only sorrow, but wit, playfulness, resilience. Friends remembered her not only for tragedy, but for humor, for generosity, for moments of warmth. These memories complicate the myth, remind us that Billie Holiday was not only victim, but survivor, not only tragic figure, but human being. Still, the myth grows. Photographs of her with gardenias in her hair become icons, posters on walls, covers of albums. Writers invoke her name as shorthand for sorrow. Singers cite her as muse. She is placed alongside Edith Piaf, Janis Joplin, Amy Winehouse, women whose brilliance was entwined with pain, whose deaths came too soon, whose lives became cautionary tales. The world seems drawn to such figures, perhaps because they embody both beauty and fragility, reminding us of the fleeting nature of art, of life itself. But to mythologize her only as tragic is to miss the deeper legacy. For Billie Holiday was not only a story of downfall, she was a story of endurance. Despite poverty, despite abuse, despite persecution, despite addiction, she sang. She created beauty out of pain, and she gave that beauty to the world. That act, repeated night after night, was itself heroic. The myth may emphasize her fall, but the truth emphasizes her persistence. Imagine her myth now, floating through time. The girl who sang against lynching, the woman who defied the bureau, the artist who sang until her body could no longer hold breath. Each version is true in part, yet none is whole. To hold her as myth is to hold her as mirror, reflecting what we wish to see, whether warning, inspiration, or lament. But somewhere behind that mirror stands Billie Holiday herself, elusive, ungraspable, her voice still reminding us that she cannot be reduced. And so, from the myths and retellings, we return again to the music. For myths may distort, but the voice does not lie. Listen to her records, and you will hear her as she was, imperfect, wounded, luminous, human. The myth may tell us she was tragic, but the music tells us she was alive, fiercely, stubbornly alive, until the silence claimed her. The stylus drops once more, the groove spins, her voice fills the room, cutting through myth, through time, through death. And in that moment, Billie Holiday is not symbol or heroine or martyr. She is simply Billie, singing, as she always did, from the center of her soul. From the myths that surrounded her rises one final question. What does it mean to remember her now, decades later? What do we carry from her life into our own time, our own world? And how does her voice continue to speak not only of the past, but of the present? From the myths that rose around her comes the final question, and it lingers like the last note of a song that refuses to fade. What does it mean to remember Billie Holiday now? Decades have passed since that July day in 1959, yet her voice still drifts across turntables, still pours from speakers, still floats through night air as though she had never left. In that persistence lies her final lesson, that truth carried in song does not die when the body falters. It endures, it transforms, it continues to speak. Her life was marked by suffering, and we cannot look away from it. Poverty, abuse, racism, persecution, addiction, all pressed against her with relentless force. To tell her story without these wounds would be to falsify it, to soften what was hard. And yet, to tell only of her suffering would also be to betray her. For Billie Holiday was not only victim, she was survivor, creator, transformer. She took the brokenness of her life and forged from it beauty that has outlived her tormentors, outlasted her pain. That paradox is her gift, and it is what makes her voice so haunting still. Listen to her recordings now, and you will hear more than music. You will hear a philosophy unspoken yet clear, that truth matters more than perfection, that vulnerability can be strength, that beauty can be born from wound. In a world that so often seeks to hide pain, to polish away imperfection, Billie Holiday reminds us that art comes not from denial but from exposure. She sang her scars, and in doing so, she taught us to listen to our own. Her legacy also asks us to reflect on justice, for she was not undone only by her own choices, but by a society that punished her for daring to speak. Strange Fruit remains her most enduring song, not only for its melody, but for its courage. A black woman standing in 1939, singing of lynching to a mixed audience, demanded a bravery that cannot be overstated, and the price she paid, hounded by agents, arrested, silenced, reveals the cost of telling truth in a world that fears it. To remember Billie Holiday is therefore also to remember the injustices that remain, to ask ourselves whether we too prefer myth to reality, silence to confrontation. But beyond history, beyond justice, there is something more intimate. There is the quiet comfort of her voice in the solitude of night. Countless listeners have found in her recordings not only sorrow but companionship. To play Good Morning Heartache in the small hours is to feel less alone. To hear Don't Explain is to recognize one's own contradictions of love and pain. To listen to God Bless the Child is to nod in weary agreement at the harshness of life. In these moments, Billie Holiday is not legend or martyr, but friend, whispering across time, saying, "I have known this too." Perhaps this is why she endures. Not because she was flawless, but because she was flawed. Not because she was untouched by life, but because she was shaped by it in every note. Her voice carries the weight of lived experience, and in it, listeners hear themselves. She is both distant, untouchable, and near, immediate, familiar. She is Lady Day, but she is also simply Billie, a woman who longed for tenderness and sang because silence was too heavy. Her story circles back to the beginning, a child in Baltimore walking cracked sidewalks, listening for music drifting from windows. She could not know that her life would arc through triumph and torment, that her voice would become immortal, that she would die handcuffed in a hospital bed. She knew only hunger, longing, hope. And perhaps that is the truest Billie of all, not the myth, not the martyr, but the child who dreamed of sound and found in herself a voice that could shake the world. As we close this circle, we are left with images. The stillness of cafe society when Strange Fruit ended, the ovation at Carnegie Hall, the flowers in her hair, the guarded eyes in photographs, the quiet laughter remembered by friends, the silence of a hospital room heavy with guards. These images, taken together, form not a tidy story but a mosaic, fractured yet luminous. To look upon it is to see both tragedy and triumph, both cruelty and beauty, both suffering and song. And finally there is silence. The silence after her last note, the silence that fell in 1959, the silence that follows still when a record ends. Yet even that silence is not empty. It hums with echo, with memory, with the faint vibration of her voice still lingering in the air. It invites us not to forget, but to listen more closely, to hear what cannot be erased. So let us remember Billie Holiday not only as tragic heroine, not only as symbol, but as woman, artist, truth-teller. Let us honor her not only with myth, but with listening, with pressing play once more, with allowing her voice to fill the room, with feeling the tremor of her truth. For as long as her songs are heard, she is not gone. She lives, fragile and strong, broken and unbowed, whispering still to all who pause to hear. And now, as the story closes, we return to the beginning. The stage is dark. The spotlight rises. Billie Holiday steps forward, flowers in her hair, microphone before her. She opens her mouth and the first note falls. Aching, trembling, beautiful. It carries across time, across silence, across death itself. It is the sound of a life lived in pain and in beauty, the sound of resilience that could not be silenced. It is Billie Holiday, Eternal Lady Day, singing forever in the memory of the world.